When Putin embarked on his special military operation 3 years ago, I very much doubt he expected his 3-day timetable to turn into 3 years. Nor did he expect his war to not only resemble World War I, but potentially last longer than it, should the peace overtures made by the White House not pan out the way the Trump administration wants. Which, given the adamant refusal of the Kremlin to compromise on any of their fundamental demands, most likely due to them sensing weakness in the American negotiating position, I'd say that's probably likely. And thus the war continuing into 2026 is an unfortunate possibility. As to why, that's what we're going to talk about today. We will be going over the battlefield situation, the history of the battles through the past year, at least in brief, the aftermath of Russia's counterattack to retake the Kursk salient, and the overall political situation. Source and information-wise, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague Perun the PowerPoint Man for his tireless efforts in processing the raw economic data, and the Institute for the Study of War for their weekly comprehensive analysis of the ongoing frontline situation, which is where I have sourced my maps for this video. I highly recommend their content as well as that of other analysts like Preston Stewart, Covert Cabal, and Ryan Macbeth for a more holistic view. So, with a pledge to remain unbiased despite my support for Ukraine and its people, let's get started. Right after a word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by a longtime friend of the channel, NordVPN. Look guys, you need a VPN in the modern day, and Nord is my personal choice, and they have been since even before my partnership with them. They are affordable, accessible, and easy to use. They have servers all over the world, giving you access to region-locked content everywhere. Their website contains every piece of information, as well as the resources required to guard your privacy while browsing. Their plans cover multiple devices, with a dedicated app for every single device, and they can share data and files using the MeshNet system. And of course, it has a full suite of security features, including a dark web tracker, comprehensive anti-malware, and browser protection, all backed up by 24/7 customer support. They also have a 30-day money-back guarantee in case you don't agree with me, so there's no risk in trying them. So I ask you, click the link in the description and get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan when you sign up. It helps me, and it will definitely help you stay safer online. And with that, back to the video. Alright, to start off this video, we're going to do a complete military breakdown, starting with manpower and working our way through all the vital factors, such as equipment, the battlefield situation, attacks and counterattacks, etc, etc. Anyway, let's get started. At the time of recording, estimates vary as to how much combat power both nations have active in theatre. Total casualty figures are also hard to nail down, as always, so let's go through the datasets we have, starting with manpower. Despite claims from propaganda channels in the West, including now the President and Vice President of the United States apparently, Ukraine has not engaged full-scale mobilization, instead choosing to remain at their current partial mobilization rate of draft and replenishment. Primary sources in Ukraine, ranging from official government figures to Ukrainian soldiers and citizens known to the author personally, confirm that Ukraine does continue to have a reserve of manpower in the 18 to 25-year-old bracket available for service should a full-scale mobilization be ordered. This is due to the fact that enlistment among Ukrainian personnel under the age of 25 is exclusively voluntary. Furthermore, active personnel in the armed forces of Ukraine currently stands at an estimated 2.2 million, with 900,000 of those being in active combat service across all branches and deployments, which through clever allocation of manpower to reserve and rear echelon units have been able to hold the line and, as we saw in Kursk, provide enough combat power to mount limited offensive operations. The manpower challenge Ukraine does face, however, is one of sustainment. Even with the reserve of younger personnel available, this represents the limit of their total available manpower for mobilization. Once they're called up, that's it. There isn't any more help coming, besides EU peacekeepers in the event of a ceasefire or foreign volunteers in the International Legion. It also poses a significant issue for the Ukrainian economic situation, as they are still trying to maintain a modern integrated economy while fighting a full-scale conventional war on a front line that exceeds 1,000 miles in length. The expanded recruitment or conscription of young men would have a severe impact on both the future of Ukraine as a nation and the current functioning of the nation's wartime economy. Ukraine's economic wealth and overall GDP is derived from its manufacturing, agricultural, and mining sectors, all of which play a key role in Ukraine's geopolitical and economic standing among the world's nations. It's for this very reason that the Trump administration immediately made American access to those resources the focal point for future negotiations regarding military aid. More on that later. What matters in this context is that the main pressure point for these sectors of the economy is that by their nature they are very labor-intensive, requiring a fit, educated and skilled workforce to maintain their productivity and contribution to the economy. If manpower constraints continue to worsen for the armed forces of Ukraine, the decision becomes whether or not it's worthwhile to risk the economic security of the country, as well as its long-term future and demographic stability, in order to retain their total sovereignty from Russia. This is doubly problematic when you consider that Ukraine is not conducting expeditionary warfare, rather it's defending its homeland from a settler colonial invasion. Russian state institutions in the eastern regions of the country, as well as the previously occupied regions of Donbas and the Crimean Peninsula, have been carrying out large-scale migration and colonization efforts, which has included large government contracts and subsidies from Moscow, and this is to ensure and encourage the Russification of the region. One large propaganda effort in this regard has been the housing projects constructed among the ruins of the city of Mariupol, which have started accepting migrants with a particular focus from Moscow to incentivize young first home buyers who will live in the region for decades, all while raising families, thereby Russifying the region. And that's not even beginning to talk about the large-scale kidnapping of Ukrainian children and their subsequent forced adoption by Russian families or youth institutions for similar assimilation. On the other side of this process, you have the Russian armed forces, whose methods in repressing civilian populations have been made painfully clear both historically during World War II, the Soviet-Afghan War and Chechnya, as well as the current conflict in places whose names are now infamous, like Bucha and Izium. Combine that with the increasingly high tendency of Russian units to execute Ukrainian POWs, and the armed forces of Ukraine are now faced with an equally difficult strategic and operational dilemma. Militarily, it would make sense to withdraw to prepare defensive positions located among terrain features that shorten the front line, while providing advantageous sightlines for the employment of standoff munitions, anti-tank munitions, and pre-sighted artillery. Hills, cities, rivers, and dense foliage bordering open areas such as tree lines and forests, and of course, the Dnieper River. This will force the attacker to concentrate considerable amounts of combat power while suffering excessive casualties to achieve only modest tactical gains, something the Ukrainians have proven very adept at doing. The defenders will be able to use the shortened lines to build a reserve and set up a layered defense along key lines of advance, the priority being main supply routes, MSRs, or in layman's terms, roads. It also allows the defenders to funnel the attacking force into kill zones by restricting their tactical options to a select few the defenders know the enemy will be forced to take, as trying anything else would either be logistically infeasible or unacceptably costly in terms of equipment and lives. Though, as the Battle of Vuhledar demonstrates, this calculus is something the Russians don't seem to be very concerned with. And yet the Ukrainians, by the very nature of Russia's war, can't take that option. Withdrawing to the Dnieper River and major population centers interspersed with defensible terrain and fortifications would result in abandoning almost 500,000 Ukrainians to the mercy of a vicious and brutal enemy, while losing the associated productivity and manpower with it, ceding territory that they will be unable to retake in the short to medium term, which, should the war continue on a negative trajectory for Ukraine, would almost certainly result in its permanent annexation by the Russian Federation. As a result of this, the Ukrainian military has adopted a policy of holding every single blade of grass within the realms of military prudence. If a situation gets really bad, they'll retreat. But as we've seen with Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, and now Kursk, the Ukrainians will continue to fight even when almost completely enveloped, buying time to set up new lines of defense, while also inflicting as much attrition on the attacking force as possible, maximizing enemy casualties and fixing a much larger enemy force in place, thereby denying the ability for the Russians to engage in maneuver or pursue operational and strategic objectives. However, as a result of this strategy, the Ukrainians are forced to concentrate manpower across the entire line of contact. So, despite their larger active manpower reserve in the field compared to the Russians, aside from local counterattacks and the aforementioned Kursk offensive, which consumed a considerable amount of their operational reserve, when combined with their material disadvantage in munitions and equipment, the Ukrainians are forced to concede the operational and strategic initiative theater-wide to the Russians. And because their strategic goals are offensive operations on enemy territory, the Russians have the luxury of choosing where to allocate their 630,000 personnel and their associated combat power. Their reserves and conscripts can be spread out along the entire battle area, absorbing local counterattacks and ceding some of their gains for a superior position. And they can do that while simultaneously exploiting their superiority in support assets and coordinated mass fires, particularly in frontal aviation such as attack helicopters and fixed-wing assets with standoff munitions, aka glide bombs, allowing them to prevent any breakthroughs by the Ukrainians. At the same time, in another sector of the front, they can then assemble elite units, such as the Spetsnaz and the VDV, supported by their remaining modern tank formations, to continue the assault and draw off Ukrainian reserves. We've seen this employed most effectively in the region of Pokrovsk, where significant gains have been made, albeit at a considerable cost in terms of time, equipment, and personnel. But that is the advantage the Russians have in this correlation of forces. While they have less in theatre, their calculus for replenishment, reconstitution, and sustainment is far better. The Russians have suffered horrendous casualties, far worse than anyone could have imagined, and while I don't believe the claims of either side regarding casualties inflicted and taken, from the footage we've seen and the confirmed equipment losses, which we will discuss in a moment, and the battlefield results accomplished thus far, at least 600,000 Russian personnel have been classified as irrecoverable losses, either killed or wounded. This is the lowest estimate from Western official sources, by the way. The Ukrainians are claiming another 300,000 on top of that, which is an optimistic figure in my view, but even if we split it down the middle, between 600 to 800,000 Russian troops have been killed or seriously wounded over 3 years of sustained combat operations. Yet despite this, they have maintained and recently increased the amount of fielded manpower they have, and they've largely accomplished this by increasing the financial incentives for contract soldiers, with some of their newer recruits getting signing bonuses and pay rates better than a lot of Western militaries. We've heard figures as high as $140,000 US combined with 3 million rubles worth of debt cancellation. I'm somewhat skeptical as to how common such a high total is, but it is emblematic of Kremlin recruiting strategy. What it shows is that the Kremlin is extremely wary about mobilizing more draftees, calculating that the political and prestige cost of that action is less expensive than just throwing money at the problem. However, there is of course the other aspect of Russian manpower utilization: penal battalions, or Storm Z units as they've been called. Cheap, disposable manpower utilized in the morbidly named meat assaults reported at critical sectors of the front where offensive operations are underway. The idea being that the defending units forced to repel these assaults will have to reveal their firing positions and the disposition of their defenses to repel it, allowing experienced units to exploit weak points in the front line. What's interesting though is when you look at how the Russians have been able to achieve these recruiting targets in other areas, given that the amount of people signing up haven't been that high, despite the financial incentives on offer, especially given the high casualty rate. What good is money if you aren't alive to spend it? And the answer is once again found in demographics. Most Russian recruits come from economically depressed areas of the Federation, which, albeit is most of it, in the same manner that recruiting officers usually use in the United States military, that being a phenomenon known as the poverty draft. It's common knowledge that across most Western countries, poorer communities are targeted for recruiting due to the upwards mobility that military service provides. And this, like in the United States military, results in Russian minority populations seeing much more representation than Western urbanites from Moscow and St. Petersburg. This also aids with political stability, as the European Russian base, or the White Russian base, are the bulwark for United Russia as a political movement, and dictators need to have their base firmly entrenched in their camp to prevent what I've started calling getting bashard. And if you want to save me from the poverty draft or getting bashard, please like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Also, if you want to support me financially, you can do so on Patreon by clicking the link in the description, or by using my promo code JDAM on your next Gamer Subs order. Anyway, thanks for your time, like and subscribe, back to the video. And this has continued to allow Russia to replenish and even expand their ranks with minimal political or economic impact. Essentially, every casualty Ukraine takes is an irreplaceable loss with severe consequences, while Russia can simply acquire more personnel, albeit with a significant decline in troop quality. In fact, the average age of a Russian soldier now is between 35 to 40, many of whom are dodging a criminal conviction, and some of the oldest we've seen are 50 to 60. And this advantage in personnel sustainment is a capability they've augmented with the assistance of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, who have since provided an estimated 12,000 trained and equipped soldiers, including a contingent of special forces. Though, given we are talking about North Korea here, your use of the word special may vary in definition. 1,000 of them have already been killed in action, with a general officer potentially among them. Thus, while the balance of forces manpower-wise isn't good for Ukraine, it is nowhere near as apocalyptic as the propaganda coming from Russia and the Western isolationist right wing suggests. Total Ukrainian casualties are estimated to be around 100,000 killed in action or missing in action, with an estimated 400,000 or so wounded, which, when you compare that to the lowest estimate of Russian casualties being 600,000, that would indicate an exchange rate of roughly 1.25 to 1 in favour of Ukraine, if not higher at 1.5 to 1, which again is not decisive, but it is significant. What will be decisive, though, is equipment losses versus replacement. All industrial wars are decided not on the fighting front, but on the factory floor. And here is where things get ridiculous. Because on Ukraine's side, you have a political shit show of absolutely biblical proportions that has and will continue to deteriorate Ukraine's already tenuous supply chain for its NATO weapons. Yet on the Russian side of things, the situation is somehow potentially worse, because we are now starting to see Soviet storage depots run out of stuff. For the record, the Soviet and later Russian state never throws things out. They either donate their surplus to a proxy or put it in storage. That's why, in the early 2010s, they shopped around all their old Cold War allies for T-34s to use as memorials or for ceremonial duty on national holidays. And it's also why we are starting to see Soviet tanks approved for production by Stalin himself currently active on the battlefield. So, with that in mind, let's talk numbers. The source we are going to use for the Russians is War Spotting, because they have this handy graphic right here, which I can put up on screen for you to look at. And because, like Oryx, which we will use for Ukraine, they only count visually confirmed losses, allowing for a more accurate estimate. Keep in mind, though, that means the loss rate is probably about 15 to 20% higher than this, because despite the omnipresent reconnaissance available on the Ukrainian front lines, not every single engagement is captured on film. Now, forgive me for not breaking down every single system in intricate detail. If you want to do that, you have access to the sources yourself, link in the description. But as you can see, Russia has taken staggering losses of material, even when you factor in their available reserves. Over 3,000 tanks, 7,000 IFVs, 800 self-propelled guns, 400 MLRS, 87 aircraft, including an Su-57. 100 helicopters, and of course, the Black Sea Fleet, which has lost 18 vessels, with 8 more damaged, rendering them restricted to port, unable to operate. And of course, you have all the supplementary systems, such as air defense, electronic warfare systems, but most importantly, trucks. Over 3,000 heavy mobility transport trucks. That is devastating, especially for an army that historically has struggled with logistics at the best of times. These losses have had a huge impact on the ability for Russia to prosecute their offensive operations. The amount of fire support Russian infantry has on the assault has been significantly degraded, as has their ability to bring indirect fire to bear on entrenched positions. Russian artillery losses have been heavy both in units destroyed and through operational losses, either from faulty North Korean ammunition blowing up the guns, or their over-reliance on massed artillery leading to accelerated degradation of the gun tubes and their firing mechanisms. Originally, Russia boasted a huge advantage in artillery over Ukraine, up to 10 to 1 in some areas of the front depending on operational demands at the time. Now, in 2025, this has dropped all the way down to 1.5 to 1 on average, with concentrations in support of offensive operations increasing this slightly. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, have fared far better overall, but that is entirely due to the fact that they are usually defending. Therefore, they have the ability to recover vehicles more frequently when they would otherwise be written off due to their retention of the battlefield. It's also harder for the Russians to confirm these losses, as once again, they don't have access to the wrecks most of the time to confirm it. Even so, Ukraine's equipment losses have still been very heavy when you consider their pre-war reserves, though this is slightly offset by the fact that a considerable amount of that hardware was tactically acquired off the Russians after their retreat from Kyiv and Izium in 2022. Overall, the Ukrainians have lost over 1,000 tanks, 1,200 IFVs, 1,200 APCs and AFVs, almost 500 self-propelled guns, 103 aircraft, 50 helicopters, and just over 1,000 trucks. When you add everything up, it roughly amounts to 7,000 individual pieces of substantial military hardware across all branches. This averages out, when looking at the stats from both Oryx and Warspotting, to a ratio of 2-to-1 in favour of Ukraine regarding attrition on equipment. Though as stated, there is a 20% variable on that statistic, along with some outliers heavily weighted in favour of Ukraine, namely the Black Sea Fleet. Yet just like with the manpower equation, the real question regarding equipment is not one of raw losses, though that most definitely is a factor. Rather, it is one of sustainment. Russia thus far has relied on its reserve stocks of Soviet equipment built up throughout the Cold War. However, research done by OSINT accounts, collated by Covert Cabal, who has been monitoring this in detail, show that Russia's largest vehicle depots are rapidly running out of serviceable vehicles. Analysis from various sources have all come to a rough consensus that the pre-war Russian tank force has been, for all intents and purposes, almost completely destroyed. We are seeing wartime production T-72s appearing more and more among Russian frontline units, along with a resurgence of T-62s, supplementing the already reactivated and deployed T-55 force. Russia has been doubling down over the past 2 years in developing AFV restoration facilities to bring more and more of their older stockpile back into service. Except these stockpiles were already looking low at the beginning of last year in terms of recoverable assets. They're now looking very low indeed. The majority of the mid-Cold War tanks still in storage were stored outside in depots since the 1990s. Now, I don't know if all of you are familiar with the climactic conditions of European Russia, but storing a vehicle unsecured and open to the elements for 20 years through savage winters and humid springs is not conducive to vehicle reliability. Rust isn't even the worst of the damage either. It's the degradation of the various rubber seals and internal electric systems, frayed wiring, and rusted through internal mechanical functions, which crucially includes the autoloaders on mid to late Cold War models, which is most likely the reason we have seen the T-55s and T-62s activated before the early model T-72s, as they have manually loaded main guns. This has its own downside, considering that Russia has not had to train dedicated loaders for their tank force since the 1970s at least, leaving a drastic skill gap. And NATO forces have proven that a well-trained and experienced loader outperforms autoloaders while aiding in standard operational tasks on the vehicle. Building that capability back up has proven to be a challenge, however it is a challenge shared with Ukraine due to their increasing reliance on NATO tanks. And the problem in recovering vehicles is of course not just restricted to tanks either. The same situation is seen across basically every single Russian storage park for every single system. BMP-1s, BTR-60s, artillery and anti-aircraft systems from World War II. I have seen Russian World War II era anti-aircraft guns being shipped to the front. An estimated 75% of Russia's strategic equipment reserves, as well as all of their serviceable T-80s, all of their T-64s, most of their post-World War II artillery, and, well, as for their trucks, there is really no other way of putting it. We have started seeing horses and donkeys among frontline Russian units in logistics and support roles. You heard that correctly. Horses and donkeys. Yeah. Yet for all of these problems, Russia has one distinct advantage in this situation, and that is its industrial base. While Russia is under sanctions from international suppliers, combined with the stresses placed on the various sectors of the economy by the war, it doesn't have access to various sources of high technology to manufacture its modern designs, like the T-90M or the mythical T-14 Armata at scale. But smaller production runs of these vehicles, or, well, at least the T-90, are still reaching the front line with some regularity. The last remaining T-80s and late model T-72 hulls are now all in the field, while wartime budget models of the modernized T-72s are still rolling off the production lines, albeit slowly with much reduced capability compared to their pre-war predecessors. And as of time of writing, we have only seen the repair and refit effort increase, with some older Soviet production facilities being reactivated to serve as restoration shops for T-72As and T-62s at scale. And I mean significant scale. While pretty much every BMP left over in Russia is being towed to those shops as we speak. Again, just like with the infantry, we will see a considerable decline in combat effectiveness due to the age and unreliability of the systems and their operators, while some vehicles will be far more work to restore than just building a new one. But at the end of the day, a big mobile metal box with guns that go bang is still very nice to have, especially when the enemy doesn't have them, which, given the current political situation, may be the case in some areas of the front in the short term. So let's talk about Ukraine's sustainment challenges. The uncertainty of continued aid from the Trump administration is a devastating blow to the current strategic outlook. There is no question about it. Since his election in November, we have seen the Russians pursue what amounted to an all-out attack all along their active offensive axes in the east of the country, as well as escalating pressure on the Kharkiv axis. And now, with Trump holding both aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine hostage, the Russians chose that exact moment to initiate their long-planned offensive operation to reduce the Kursk salient in the hope of ensuring that when the next round of expected peace talks occur, sometime mid-year, that the only occupied territory is Ukrainian, denying them leverage. Some commentators have pointed out that the timing of this Russian attack is exceptional, given they were able to issue warning orders and initiate contact less than 48 hours after Trump cut off intelligence to Ukraine, preceding the offensive with the single largest assault on Ukraine's strategic interior by drones and cruise missiles since the beginning of the war. Whether there is any correlation between these two incidents is unclear. Russia has been preparing forces to clear Kursk since last year, but to execute an operation of this scale in such a short turnaround, in conjunction with a mass missile barrage at the exact moment it would be most effective during an intel blackout, leads one to suspect that the Russians may have had forewarning of this development. From the time between cutoff of intelligence to its restoration after ceasefire talks began, EU partners were struggling to fill the gap, and the sudden loss of targeting data for advanced precision NATO systems to the restoration of their recon strike complex, there was a brief window where the Russian counteroffensive would be the most effective, and given reports coming out of Kursk right now in the aftermath, that gamble was successful. Russian forces made rapid and decisive gains in the Kursk defensive salient, threatening to cut the main MSR to Sudzha from Ukrainian territory while destroying bridges with precision munitions, essentially doing what the Ukrainians did during their initial offensive, only in reverse. Though this success has not come without suffering a number of setbacks, most famously, and memed to death by now, an abortive attempt to try and play Mario Brothers through a pipeline, only to get smacked by Ukrainian drones and artillery the moment they popped out. Ukrainian troops withdrew from the position, albeit quickly, to prevent encirclement, leaving a substantial amount of equipment behind. Though early reports from the rearguard say that fighting around the town of Sudzha may be a miniature Bakhmut. However, it depends if Ukraine wants to spend their stretched manpower to defend it, in the hope of retaining a bargaining chip, even if it is only a couple of settlements on the border. They'll need all the help they can get ahead of the talks in Saudi Arabia, and of course they'll also hold down at least 40,000 Russian troops in the area for a while longer. In any case, the aftermath of this operation is still developing at time of writing and is just one component of the overall conflict. Suffice to say that for such a well-planned and executed offensive to happen at the exact time, in the exact window of opportunity, in conjunction with all other branches of the Russian military in theatre, suggests that they knew this window was coming. Whether it was a calculated risk based in a suspected change in US policy regards Ukraine, or a senior member of the Trump administration advised the Kremlin that military aid and intelligence provision to Ukraine would be cut off on that date. Indeed, several of America's allies have been more selective with the intelligence it shared to the United States based on real fears that it could end up in Russian hands. However, all of it is conjecture, and we'll never be able to ascertain which is true. That said, given the known history of Trump and his contacts inside the former Soviet Union during Perestroika, the proven link between Russian intelligence and senior Trump campaign officials during both elections, his already hostile relationship with Zelensky due to Zelensky's refusal to aid Trump in his political blackmail in exchange for military aid, that resulted in his impeachment, by the way, and some of the largest media outlets supporting the MAGA movement being proven to be directly funded by the FSB, namely Tenet Media and Tucker Carlson respectively, circumstantial evidence does suggest that a mole inside the executive branch and the intelligence services is a distinct possibility. Furthermore, we are now hearing in the aftermath of this operation that during the initial attack, Russian artillery and air assets started to hit depots and headquarters buildings in Kursk far more accurately than before the intel sharing was cut off. I recommend you all draw your own conclusions. Anyway, The Ukrainian reversal in Kursk is bad. This is true, there's no getting around it. However, there have also been numerous limited but effective counterattacks against the main Russian axis of advance in the east. The town of Toretsk, once taken completely by the Russians, is once again contested, while the advance on Pokrovsk has been halted and subsequently thrown back, with Ukrainian forces regaining their original defensive positions and locally seizing the initiative. Across the front, Russian forces have continued offensive operations, but only in Kursk and the Donbass have they had any success. Everywhere else, they've been stopped dead in their tracks. Ukraine, against all the odds, is holding the line. How long they will continue to hold it is contingent on the resupply they can expect from their European allies, as Trump has made it apparent that even with the restoration of aid, continued and reliable resupply from the United States is unlikely, unless Putin makes the biggest diplomatic fumble of all time, and as stupid as he's been, I don't think he'll be that stupid. This will have serious implications for Ukraine's sustainment of the Patriot missile systems, vital for countering the Russian ballistic missile and hypersonic threats. It will also pose serious issues in sustaining the Ukrainians' favourite weapon systems in the field, that being the Bradley IFV and of course the HIMARS. However, due to the reluctance of the United States to provide Abrams, this won't impact their heavy armoured forces too badly. That and Australia sent the entirety of its old Abrams stockpile complete with spares, seeing as we've got new ones. Land Down Under intensifies. Sorry about that, guys. I don't get to be obnoxiously patriotic that often. But that does give us a microcosm of the reality of the situation regarding the unreliability of American aid. Its impact on the raw capability of the Ukrainian military is actually not that significant. The majority of tanks, IFVs, and APCs in service are European in origin. Marders, Leopards, Challengers, CV-90s, and the mighty Speedy Boy. I've got to give the French credit, the AMX-10 is badass. The remainder is all ex-Soviet equipment, which they can resupply themselves domestically and with the aid of former Warsaw Pact countries. Poland, Romania, Czechia, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the Baltic states have constantly shipped replacement BMPs and T-72s, restocking with NATO standard gear as they went. And with Finland now in the alliance, this has continued. This reserve of resources is not anywhere near as deep as the Russian stockpile, but with the withdrawal of the United States potentially occurring, these countries are now expediting the delivery of their remaining spares, giving Ukraine a consistent reserve to draw upon throughout the conflict. It really is incredible seeing the amount of aid delivered to Ukraine globally. Like, I know what you see on screen is Wikipedia, so it's out of date and of course dubious sourcing sometimes, but just look at this. Look how far I have to scroll before I even hit the United States section near the bottom. And of course, Oryx has released data on this as well. And just as I was writing this script, the French have announced a rapid response package to Ukraine, including another shipment of AMX-10s, Mirage 2000 fighters, ammunition for NATO 155mm shells, and long-range AASM 250 Hammer standoff munitions, along with other equipment up to a value of $220 million US. In fact, we already have images of a Mirage shooting down a Russian cruise missile, granting Ukraine the ability to replace and sustain its fixed-wing assets going forward. This also goes for the F-16, because despite its American origin, it is also the world's most widely exported NATO fighter. Munitions and spares for those are going to be relatively easy to source from around the place, as long as Europe is willing to assist in that effort, which all indications suggest that they are. What I'm trying to get at is, equipment is not going to be an issue for Ukraine, at least not for a while. And with the Europeans pledging to rearm at a rapid pace after the Oval Office debacle, and the Munich Security Conference demonstrated that the Trump administration is unwilling to aid its allies, modernization efforts across Europe's militaries will free up older weapon systems for donation, all of which using NATO standard munitions. We've already seen this process underway, with Rheinmetall leading the charge on not only establishing a repair shop inside Ukraine. With the Americans withdrawing from the picture, they have already begun converting their domestic automotive factories to aid in military production. Gear is not going to be an issue. And now by this point, the Vatniks and the American isolationist crowd are already screaming propaganda at the screen and leaving an angry comment. That is, if they haven't already. And they're all going to be calling me delusional and a shill. So here is where the but comes in. And it's going to be that word again. Sustainment. Europe, for all its big talk and efforts over the past 3 years to support Ukraine's defense, have been utterly reliant on the United States to make up the shortfall in providing ammunition to support Ukraine's high-end weapon systems. HIMARS, Patriot, GMLRS rounds, HARMS, JDAMs, Excalibur shells, ATACMS, and the mass production of ammunition for the 25mm Bushmaster, tow missiles, javelins, AMRAAMs for the NASAMS and the F-16s. And while I have a sneaking suspicion that the Poles will suddenly and accidentally lose ammunition for these systems on the upcoming NATO training exercises, it won't be enough to cover demand, especially regarding Ukraine's air defense. IRST can fill the gap for drones, but those missiles aren't anywhere near as prevalent as US-made systems, and only the MIM-104 Patriot can reliably counter the ballistic missile threat while deterring Russian fixed-wing assets from pushing close into Ukrainian airspace. Should Trump cut aid again, the loss of this system will hurt. Badly. There is no other way to put it but bluntly. A decision to halt US aid to Ukraine will not make peace more likely, nor will it cripple Ukrainian frontline operations. They can and will continue to fight. What it would do is ensure that a lot of Ukrainians will die needlessly to Russian drone and missile strikes. And yet, we still have to discuss the 155mm elephant in the room: artillery rounds. This is the single most crucial issue for both of the warring nations, and in this area, Russia has a decisive advantage, producing 30% more ammunition annually than the entire EU put together. During the stalling of aid in the first half of 2024, when Republicans locked down Ukraine aid packages in Congress, the shell shortage for frontline artillery units was the largest contributor to Russia's battlefield success. Granted, that success was still expensive, given over half of all Russian casualties sustained throughout the entire war were inflicted in 2024, but without the ability to sustain counter-battery and breakthrough suppression operations, the Ukrainians suffered terribly. And with the cessation of American aid, the ammunition situation is once again going to be desperate if things don't go the way Trump wants them. Though, by Putin's decision to make extensive use of North Korean ammunition and now personnel, Ukraine has found an unlikely ally, which until now had been officially neutral and unwilling to provide ammunition to Ukraine directly due to their arms export restrictions. Namely, South Korea. That's right, NATO has been lying to you this entire time. Ukraine is a proxy war, but not between Russia and NATO. No. The DMZ is in stalemate, so we are going the long way. Let's just hope the AFU chief doesn't embrace his inner MacArthur and decide that to secure his future election as president, he should invade Crimea with rib boats and then nuke Moscow, turning it into an irradiated sea of cobalt. That could be interesting, though, I must admit. Anyway, talks are in the early stages as of now, but relations between the two countries have been improving as of late due to the aforementioned factors. And given the United States' withdrawal from international agreements, including senior administration officials publicly floating the idea of abandoning even its military alliances, NATO and Taiwan to be precise, America's global partners are now considering their options. Defeating Russia and stimulating domestic industry for rearmament simultaneously is definitely a good deal as far as the ROK is concerned. It solves 2 out of 3 very big, very red, and very scary problems, so we may see movement to greater cooperation on that front. Australia too has elevated its commitment, while our ammunition manufacturers have opened new facilities to cope with global demand. But no one has acted more decisively than Rheinmetall, who has started developing new munitions plants all over Europe, most recently in Lithuania, while the Czechs are continuing to forge ahead alongside Denmark with their own ammunition production initiatives. The Danes especially have started to lock in. Considering. However, all of this has one gigantic caveat. And that caveat is time. These facilities will take at least 6 months to a year to hit their full stride, and though production is increasing, it is simply impossible to meet current demand. And not just for 155mm. Pretty much everything is in demand. The drone assaults launched by both sides have seen a massive spike in the demand for anti-aircraft ammunition. Thankfully, though, stockpiles for that are pretty high. But so is consumption, because oh boy. Have you seen the sky during a Shahed strike? I've seen raves with less energy than these gunners, and I'm reliably informed that in Sydney the raves are more lethal. which makes sense seeing as the Ukrainians have rallied literally half the militias in the country, including housewives and teachers on their off hours, to take down those drones. Meanwhile, getting jumped in the back alleys behind the club is always a hazard here, especially in Melbourne. Ugh. Anyway, to sum it all up, Ukraine's domestic production is still relatively good for Soviet systems, as like Russia they've reactivated their old Soviet arsenals that have been laying dormant for years, while former Eastern Bloc nations can back them up for the moment. But without the United States reliably supporting them, the advanced munitions for Patriot, HIMARS, and the electronic warfare equipment for the F-16 is going to be near impossible to replace consistently, while Europe is going to take time in order to fully meet their battlefield requirements for all the other NATO systems they have in service. There is, however, one unique dynamic to Ukraine's military-industrial complex that is not only meeting operational demand, but is actually exporting weapon systems back to Europe. And that, of course, is drones. Ukraine's embracing and now pioneering of unmanned aerial warfare is something that will be studied by analysts and historians for decades to come. Zelensky himself has set a production target of 30,000 long-range drones and 3,000 ballistic missiles for this year alone, and their strategic bombing campaign of Russian energy facilities is starting to have a serious effect on the enemy's oil and gas industry. Exact figures on how much of an effect are now classified as state secrets by Moscow, which to me says everything you need to know. And of course, since recording that line, guess what? We get a look at the ceasefire conditions from Putin, and what is the first condition? Stop bombing our refineries. So, yeah. Draw your own conclusions there. And Ukraine are now regularly hitting targets inside Russia that are further away than any non-ballistic NATO weapon system can reach, including Moscow, which they hit in strength as I was writing this paragraph. At least 91 impacts in the Russian capital itself were reported as part of a wider strike. In response, however, the Russians have now assembled their own domestic production facilities for improved variants of the Iranian platforms they relied on in 2024, and they are producing them at scale. Over the winter, Russia has been attempting to once again knock out Ukrainian power stations and waterworks in an attempt to cause disruptions to industry while freezing the population. During that time, they threw an estimated 2,000 drones a month for 6 months straight. However, damage to critical infrastructure was negligible due to the sheer amount of air defense Ukraine has set up to counter slow-moving 21st century buzz bombs, and the fact that since the harsh winter of 22-23, they have put a lot of effort towards integrating with Visegrad's power network to make up for shortfalls on their domestic grid. Add in a milder winter by European standards, and the calculus against all the odds leads to Ukraine somehow winning the strategic air war. My theory is that due to the casualties inflicted to Russia's air defense system along the front lines, which has been the main focus of Ukraine's long-range precision strikes for over a year now, and the political imperative to protect population centers in European Russia so Putin can keep jumping on TV to say, "Don't worry, comrades, everything is fine," they just don't have the assets to cover their strategic infrastructure. And fun fact, the same thing happened to Germany during World War II, where they were forced to defend the home front at the cost of their frontline defenses. If only Ukraine had the same kind of smash 8th Air Force did. And speaking of the air war, we've covered pretty much every new development already. The status quo has continued since the last time we talked about it, over 6 months ago now. Tactical aviation is limited, both sides fly defensive combat air patrols, and Russia launches its strategic aviation regiments to lob cruise missiles. The only close air support missions that ever get flown are with long-range standoff munitions, and it's here we find the only meaningful change. That being Ukrainian efforts to counter the ever-present glide bomb threat, which has only gotten deadlier with the improvements the Russians have made to the system. But thankfully, they have started having considerable success with dedicated anti-glide bomb electronic warfare assets. Naturally, these systems are classified, and information regarding electronic countermeasures is very tightly controlled. But a friend of mine, Spaghetti Kozak, personally attests to me that he is only alive today because those systems work. And with the numbers coming in from the front lines, that information corresponds to a serious reduction in losses to these weapons, so evidently they're working. Meanwhile, in the Black Sea, the same situation still prevails. Both sides have so many drones and anti-ship missiles flying around that large-scale naval operations for either side are essentially impossible. The only thing Russia can do is send out corvettes and frigates to launch the occasional missile strike. Just a few days ago, the Black Sea Fleet sortied a couple of Tarantul-class corvettes to maintain the caliber cruise missile threat against Odessa. But other than that, nothing. Furthermore, Odessa is now officially reopened for commercial maritime traffic. Ukraine, in cooperation with Turkey and Romania, are now able to secure their primary seaport from blockade, damaging or sinking any Russian vessel which tries to approach them with terrifying consistency. Though again, without reliable guaranteed access to US intel, this may change unless Turkey are willing to step in, which, after their diplomatic support for Ukraine in the wake of Trump's posturing, actually seems to be rather likely. However, by far the coolest thing I've seen the Ukrainian Navy do in recent times is mount R-73 infrared-guided missiles to their naval drones so they can ambush Russian helicopters operating near Crimea. So far, they've shot down one and damaged another, while posing a whole new threat axis for the Black Sea Fleet to contend with. And with that last fun little factoid, we have concluded the discussion of the military part of the video. And by a clever process of elimination, which I'm sure you've all worked out, we have now reached the chapter that you're actually here for. It's time to talk about the elusive ceasefire, peace talks, and politics. Here we go. Alright, I'm gonna be real. You know, I said this was going to be an unbiased video. I was talking about my military analysis, and in case you didn't pick up on literally everything I've said in the past hour, TLDR, Russia will win if they are willing to pay the price for it unless the West gets involved directly, which, spoiler alert, has been the analysis offered by basically everyone since this war started, including me. But in the political sphere of this video, I can't stay unbiased because I am, at least according to Twitter, a commie liberal warmonger cuck paid by George Soros to transgender mice. Which is obviously false because I am currently and will continue to dead-name Elon's platform, so evidently I'm flexible on the last part. In all seriousness, I need to lay my cards on the table. I am a pro-Ukraine libertarian progressive. I like strong trade unions, a strong military, free speech, democracy, universal healthcare, and universal education, all protected by a very heavily armed citizenry made up of every sexuality, identity, colour, and creed. Though it may be a shock to many Americans hearing this, these things can in fact coexist. I know most of you probably don't care for or even care about my political views, but in the interests of transparency and not to do the same crap the mainstream media does, I feel the need to be upfront about them before I talk about this. Because I am about to ruffle some feathers. So let's talk about politics. This video was supposed to come out a few days ago after the fiasco in the Oval Office, which everyone has subsequently milked to death for content on this website. Then things went so insane, I had to cover it all. But for the record, it shouldn't surprise you that I am firmly with Zelensky on this one. JD Vance is an embarrassment to the United States of America and a disgrace to the uniform he used to wear. And that's not coming from me, by the way. That's coming from his own cousin, who is currently fighting for Ukraine, and pretty much every veteran I've spoken to about the incident. As for my personal take, well, I've never served in the military, so I have no right to comment on his service. That said, I worked the weekend overnight shift at McDonald's in what you Americans call the hood, and I worked there for 4 years during senior year in college. And I should also qualify that in Australia, McDonald's is our equivalent of the Waffle House, and my branch was next to a bar. So I'm pretty sure I've seen more combat than him at least. Amazingly though, I never had to be a chairbender. Although I did have to eject a man from the premises after dodging a plant that he dug out of the garden in front of the store and threw at me through the window, sending glass everywhere, which we also had to sweep up later. Prick. Sorry, that was a bad night, and it's also off topic. Anyway, the entire argument in the Oval Office was a stain on the diplomatic legacy of the Office of the President. Marco Rubio was deeper in that couch out of embarrassment than JD Vance ever was. Though that's more of a shortcoming for JD in more ways than one. Do you see Rubio's face here? This man wanted to die right there, watching US foreign policy for the last 100 years explode right in front of him on his watch. The big blow-up was apparently over Zelensky correcting President Trump on a detail about the ongoing conflict, which prompted JD Vance to jump into the conversation and demand that Zelensky show appropriate gratitude to the United States, saying that he had been taking a free ride for 3 years with no gratitude to the glorious leader, The same glorious leader who tried to strong-arm Zelensky into blackmailing a political opponent and cooperating with the FBI when they investigated him. In fact, for your information, Zelensky has publicly thanked the United States by name no less than 97 times, including during a visit to the United States Congress, where he presented a Ukrainian flag signed by the defenders of Bakhmut, who all wrote small messages of gratitude for American support in defending their freedom. Many of the men who signed that flag have since given their lives for that cause after the Republican Party blocked Ukraine aid in Congress less than a year later, directly under the influence and instructions of now President Donald Trump, resulting in an ammunition shortage that allowed the Russians to carry out a front-wide offensive in the Donbass that successfully captured several major settlements and towns, albeit at the cost of the highest casualties incurred against the invader throughout the entire war. Trump and Vance, during that meeting, demonstrated not just an ignorance on the strategic situation in Ukraine or its tactical realities, they also demonstrated their lack of interest in the plight of the Ukrainian people or towards peace in general, despite their protestations otherwise. The moral grandstanding they've done about wanting peace is a laughable contrast to their domestic policies, where they have initiated a trade war against practically the entire planet while threatening to annex Canada, Panama, and Greenland. They have, ironically, at a Munich conference, though it seems rather apt given what's been happening, made it clear that they wish to abandon European security commitments entirely and have even publicly discussed withdrawing from the NATO alliance. Now, while I personally agree with the American position that Europe should be spending more on defense, similar to countries like Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, Poland, and Japan, to very publicly take this position while an adversary is waging war in Europe while expanding their diplomatic relations with China and North Korea, the two nations America is concerned about the most militarily in the coming decades, seems rather short-sighted to me. China is already making overtures to the EU and Ukraine diplomatically to see if they can get a piece of the action now that the United States has taken this foreign policy angle, and we have started to see some movement on that front even in Ukraine, not to mention the impact this will have on US arms manufacturing and power projection capability. The government of Portugal has already publicly stated its intention to cancel its potential order for the F-35, citing the US government's unreliability as an ally or a supplier. Lockheed Martin's stocks have plummeted to lower than the Afghan withdrawal levels. Doge, under He Who Shall Not Be Named, is targeting the shutdown of a munitions plant, despite the DoD saying they wouldn't, and if NATO and other US alliances fracture over this shift in policy, the forward bases which simplify America's logistical and power projection framework for operations in the Asia-Pacific would be severely hampered, if not utterly compromised. And given just this past week, we have seen China testing prototypes of what appear to be large-scale amphibious warfare equipment, including landing ships and floating harbors, I don't think it takes much imagination to see how they might benefit from such a breakup of the world order. As an Australian, that makes me very nervous. The restriction of intel and weapons to Ukraine by the Trump administration has been a diplomatic and geopolitical disaster. And while the trade war is its own separate issue outside my field of expertise and the scope of this video, the stock market has lost over $5 trillion in value over the past 30 days, with one of the hardest hit companies being Tesla, which I'm sure is just a coincidence, but, hey ho, what do I know? Yet all of this comes back to the hot button topic of the day: ceasefires and peace talks. What sort of arrangement would Ukraine be likely to accept? What would Russia consider a fair offer? How does the Trump administration plan on handling it, and how does Europe play into those discussions? Well, let's get the hardest part out of the way, or maybe it's the easiest part. Let's talk about the Ukrainian position. From a purely strategic standpoint, the Ukrainians have already achieved their primary war aim, that being the preservation of their independence and sovereignty from Russia. Even with Trump's administration essentially supporting Russia's negotiating position, with the backing of Europe and their success on the battlefield throughout 2024, Ukraine's continued existence is guaranteed unless Putin decides on a nuclear option or a maximum effort, drafting every military-aged male for another all-out assault. And even then, I'm not sure after their equipment losses, combined with the time the Ukrainians have had to fortify their interior lines, that they'd be able to achieve it. Unfortunately, that is where the good news ends. With the loss of Kursk, the Ukrainians have lost a considerable piece of leverage, and statements from both the Kremlin along with the White House suggest that Putin is framing the retreat of Ukrainian troops from the salient as an act of goodwill from Russia, allowing them to leave safely in exchange for a softening of the US bargaining position regarding a ceasefire proposal. Originally, the demand for a full ceasefire was unconditional, which Ukraine agreed to, most likely under pressure of the continued withholding of aid and intelligence should they refuse. Not to mention the mineral deal to cover the costs of said aid and intelligence being provided. Which is extortion, by the way, but this is how the Trump administration operates, and we should expect it to continue along this trajectory. To say that Ukraine is in a weak bargaining position would be a fair assessment. However, they do have several cards that they can play. First of all, they have Europe's unconditional backing as far as it looks, for the simple reason that it's their ass on the line too, and should Russia achieve their goals while normalizing relations with a now hostile United States, it compromises their entire security posture. Not to mention the reconstruction effort will by definition need to be led by Europe, along with the security guarantees that Ukraine has made very clear is a prerequisite for any negotiated peace with Moscow. As we mentioned in the last chapter, Rheinmetall's stock price has gone to space for very good reasons, and other major European conglomerates will follow suit in the construction, energy and shipping sectors, once the rebuilding begins. Naturally, the United States wants its cut of that as well, given Trump's posturing. However, if they end up fully betraying Ukraine, they can say goodbye to all of those opportunities unless they cut a deal with Russia to exploit the Donbass themselves, which is not completely out of the question, given we have already confirmed that preliminary talks have been held between US and Russian companies to that effect. Yet the consequences, foreign policy-wise, for taking such a step would be most likely too far, even for this administration. The one thing Zelensky is counting on with his maneuvers around the ceasefire is, rather intelligently, Trump's ego. Putin is doing the same thing, of course, except now, given Ukraine has accepted a ceasefire offer without condition, Putin has since been put in the very awkward position of having to either accept it or face repercussions from his erstwhile ally. And very quickly, we got our answer. Putin has not only refused to accept an unconditional ceasefire, but he also refused to allow any Ukrainians to withdraw from Kursk. For the record, he didn't have a choice in that matter. The Ukrainians withdrew in good order, albeit at rapid speed, leaving equipment behind. Anyway, furthermore, Putin promised that he would treat any Ukrainian POWs taken in Kursk under the conditions specified by international law, except that they would be tried as terrorists. Simply put, Putin rejected any form of ceasefire with Ukraine without his demands being met in full, without any concessions on his part, even with POWs. Ukraine and Europe quite obviously know the score here. They knew Putin would reject terms of truce no matter how Trump and his administration try otherwise. Hi, post-production Animarchy here, and let me just say, well. Putin did agree to a ceasefire, on the condition that Ukraine stop attacking his energy as I mentioned before, but what happened after was even funnier. Because within an hour of saying that to Trump, Putin bombed Ukrainian power stations. Yeah. Since then, the Ukrainians have blown up their bomber base, which was quite impressive. The explosion could be seen for miles. But, yeah. Turns out, ceasefires with Putin don't work. Oh, I couldn't have put any money on that one. Man, that's wild, eh? We can live in the hope that they will learn from this experience and apply more pressure, but besides the new sanctions imposed on trade and energy this past week, I doubt we will see any movement on that score. Too many senior members of the administration are personally hostile to Zelensky and positively disposed towards Putin. Plus, there is also the distinct possibility they may have been compromised by Russian intelligence. So, what are Ukraine's negotiating positions? Well, despite Zelensky's refusal to commit to any recognition of occupied territory, which is largely the position of Ukrainian military personnel, from coded language we've seen throughout the negotiation process, it appears that they may be considering ceding the Donbass and Crimea, as they have been functionally Russian since their occupation in 2014. A move some Ukrainians consider a fair compromise, given that the Ukrainians who want to be Ukrainian have by now already moved west to Kyiv half a decade ago. What is not up for debate is security guarantees, full sovereignty over both defense and foreign policy, but most importantly, the return of all Ukrainian children kidnapped by the Russian state for Russification. Any peace plan that doesn't meet these three criteria will likely be rejected out of hand on principle, regardless of what Trump and Putin agree between themselves, even if Trump cuts off aid. And as for territorial concessions beyond that, it once again depends on what they give up and where. Trump and Putin have already had a phone conversation addressing these matters, without the Ukrainians might I add, and Putin's position seems pretty clear. His original demands stand. We know this because in a press conference given by Trump, one of the conditions Putin highlighted is control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the surrounding territory. This also likely includes Dnipro and Kherson, as well as to give Russia complete control of the Dnipro basin, and with it control of the water supply to Crimea, along with one of the former Soviet Union's most advanced facilities that provides power for the entire regional grid. Naturally, I don't expect Zelensky to agree to surrender any major population center, nor the power plant for obvious reasons. However, I think the possibility that Trump may withdraw support for Ukraine if they don't agree to Russia's territorial demands is highly likely. Therefore, this will again depend on Europe being willing to foot the bill for Ukraine's defense in full, and gamble on a Soviet-Afghan war scenario, where partisan warfare and a long, grinding offensive campaign costing hundreds of thousands of Russian lives goes on and on and on until Putin is ousted or dies in office, resulting in a withdrawal by a disorganized, collapsing Russian state. And despite the overtures of peace from Zelensky and the Ukrainians to discuss an end to hostilities, the Ukrainian soldiers I've spoken to and the evidence I've seen adds another dimension to this entirely. The dimension of partisan warfare, or as the Russians would call it, terrorism. Throughout the entire conflict, the Russians in occupied Ukraine have been under relentless attack not only from drones, artillery and HIMARS, but from the citizenry itself. The local resistance has proved to be a constant threat. There are no less than 5 distinct partisan armies across the occupied regions, the largest being Atesh. In the occupied city of Melitopol, the Russians have barely been able to maintain a functioning government, as every time they appoint a new administrator to run the municipal side of their occupation, he gets killed in a precisely targeted car bombing. In fact, half of the actionable intelligence Ukraine uses when it strikes the ammo dumps, SAM sites and lines of communication behind enemy lines comes from resistance groups like Atesh, locating and marking them. I even know of one case where a Ukrainian double agent working for the DPR targeted a munition storage facility in Donetsk by walking into it and leaving his iPhone in there with Find My iPhone enabled. It has been made very clear to me by the veterans I've spoken to that should an unsatisfactory peace deal be forced upon them by the Kremlin, or the White House for that matter, we may see a return to the dark days of the late 80s and early 90s. Republika Srpska, Croatian nationalists, the Provisional and New IRA, the PLO and the Red Army faction, all of them rolled into one. An entire country full of combat veterans, supported by a Western world who has spent the last 20 years fighting a counterinsurgency, learning how to deal with explosives and build IEDs, in an age of Google, Amazon, and drone warfare. Think about it. If there isn't a lasting acceptable peace negotiated on fair terms with Ukraine, Russia will be dealing with an insurgency the likes of which the Taliban or ISIS could only dream of carrying out. And all of these affordable kamikaze drones, all these high-tech weapons, mountains of AKs, millions of rounds of ammunition, and let's not forget, Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse. How much fertilizer do you think they have stored in warehouses around the place? If this isn't handled intelligently, we could be seeing something truly horrifying take shape. And trust me, take it from a guy who studied history. I've seen what right-wing nationalist militias can achieve with a fake stabbed in the back myth. Imagine what they could do with a real one. I know it's not a topic people like to talk about, especially among the pro-Ukraine camp and even amongst Ukrainians themselves. But the fact is, like in our own countries with MAGA, UKIP, One Nation, the AfD, and a million other far-right movements currently taking place in the West, Ukraine has its own issues with right-wing nationalism, especially during a time of war. They have Azov, Svoboda, and Pravy Sektor, just to name the biggest. Before the war, they only ever got 1% of the vote. The majority of Ukrainians, all the ones I've met, are bright, friendly, cultured, and cosmopolitan people. But anyone who's read a history book knows that despite its serious issues, Berlin was the capital of a new Europe, the largest hub of avant-garde art, science, music, and culture It was a beacon of light in the world. Germany was a land of renewal, rebirth, a vibrant yet unstable democracy, trying to rebuild a nation in the wake of global tragedy. And yet look what the scars of a lost war, inflamed by bitter, hate-filled nationalists, did to them. I know I will probably upset a few people by making this comparison or bringing it up at all, especially given Ukraine's history around nationalist movements like the OUN and the endless avalanche of Kremlin propaganda surrounding them. But this is something everyone, including Russia, should be thinking about. We cannot have another Versailles, and we must not have another Munich. And all of this will be definitely playing on Zelensky's mind and the mind of European leaders. They will be negotiating with the future of Ukraine in mind and the creation of a lasting peace. Europe will rearm, as well as Ukraine. Peacekeepers have been volunteered by several nations already, including Australia, should they prove necessary. Yet all of this hinges on Putin. And as we've established, Putin has already said no. The Russian negotiation position is the same as it always is. It is a game of absolutes. Pitch high and then let the other side whittle you down. Trump and the United States are the ones scrambling over themselves to get a peace deal. They want to redirect their assets to upcoming domestic campaigns in Mexico, Canada, and Panama, while meeting the threat of China in the South Pacific. Furthermore, Trump, like all would-be dictators, including Putin in his early days, needs to score some big public relations wins. He needs to end the war, get his peace prize, and turn around to his supporters shouting, "See it? Look, guys, I'm the man who did it. I'm the man who gets things done, folks. I'm the guy in charge. I'm the one doing all the great things, okay? No one else can do it like me. No one else will be me." He has to be able to do that, regardless of how much it costs Ukraine, Europe, and the stability of American foreign policy, as well as its economic hegemony, which he is already trashing. Domestically, he already has a low approval rating in the first 3 months in office. The economy is tanking. The problems he swore to fix are not being fixed. Veterans are getting fired from the VA. Benefits and programs that low-income families rely on are being slashed. The average working Americans, the majority of whom voted for him, are now realizing what is going on, to the extent that a lot of Republicans are not doing town halls anymore for fear of bad publicity. I've been hearing reports of Trump signs being taken down all over the place. Things are going to hell fast. He needs a win to shore up his base, which, despite the best efforts of social media moguls and their AI bots on their sites, is looking rather shaky. Trump likes to project an image of strength, but the truth is, in this negotiation, it's not Trump who holds the cards. It's Putin. Some people say it's because Trump is actually Agent Krasnov, or someone in his administration is at least, and that may be true. But the reality is, Putin has the battlefield initiative. He has more men and equipment to throw into the grinder. He's recently retaken Kursk, he holds 20% of Ukraine, and from what he can tell, a third of the US population sympathizes with him because their glorious leader tells them to, while another third is indifferent or just wants a tax cut. From where he is sitting, Trump and the Republican Party need this peace deal more than he does. They conceded ground at the outset and turned on their allies in his favor. So even though he has rejected the ceasefire proposal, he accepted it on principle if the Americans concede to his demands. Those demands were a halt to all arms shipments to Ukraine from any party, a permanent halt to training, recruitment, or sustainment of all Ukrainian military units, and pre-negotiated concessions regarding territory. They also want a permanent moratorium on any security alliance, NATO or otherwise, and of course, none of these restrictions, none of these concessions apply to Russia. Russia will get everything it wants and give up nothing. And because the United States doesn't have any leverage that Trump is willing to use, apart from sanctions, weak sanctions at that, sanctions that are irrelevant because their economy is on a war footing, as is their political system, which benefits Putin domestically while rendering themselves resistant to punitive sanctions and tariffs. The only thing that could conceivably hurt him is an expansion of US military aid by several factors, and given Trump's platform, that won't happen unless Putin directly insults him, and as I've said, he's far too clever for that. Ergo, the American administration is going to do the only thing they can do: exert leverage on Ukraine to force more concessions to Russia. We're already starting to see it happen. So Putin has absolutely no motive whatsoever to pursue peace at this time. He is playing for all the time he can get to see how far he can push things before the Americans start playing hardball. And if early indicators are anything to go by, he is confident that his forces can achieve their goals on the battlefield regardless of whatever concessions Washington demands. All he needs to do is avoid crossing over the line to where America resumes full-scale support due to his intransigence. He will drag out these negotiations for as long as possible, and even then, he might ultimately decide to fight on anyway. However, with France and Britain already stepping up to fill the void regarding intelligence in defiance of Washington, it depends on what he's willing to spend in terms of money and lives. But, as we know, this is Russia, and it's Putin's Russia at that. So as long as he has people and stuff to throw, he will throw it. Time will tell to see how that pans out. What I can be sure is that despite all the pressure being put on them, the Ukrainians seem to be resolved to fight this one out one way or the other, with our help or without it. And the only thing we will achieve by withdrawing from the fight is condemning the Ukrainians to their deaths. So in my view, we must back them to the hilt, donate to their defense, and put pressure on our politicians to make sure they know we support the Ukrainian struggle. Hopefully, and I pray for this, and I'm not a religious man, hopefully, a just, honest, and lasting peace will come this year. But I have my doubts. Yet despite all that I've said in this video, my one point remains clear. As always, Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you next time. Well, now somebody better pick up that phone because I fucking called it!